Hello, and welcome to Mormons, Mystics, and Muons, and Infants on Thrones. We've got Glenn here from Infants on Thrones, and Eldon and I are here. And so we're going to both be publishing this, but Glenn and I have been chatting a bit over email as I'd listened to a few of your episodes and saw a lot of overlap. And so just want to get together and have a chat. So I guess we'll introduce ourselves and our channel a bit and for people on your channel, and you can do that as well.
That's good.
So yeah, I guess Eldon, you want to cover our channel and then turn it over to Glenn?
Yeah, my name's Eldon, and Gabe and I contacted one another here in just this year as we've both been on our own personal journeys, which led us through faith transitions and into spirituality. And a lot of common ground that we share has led us to start a podcast, which we call Mystics, Mormons, Mystics, and Muons. And we're excited to have Glenn, who I think is far more experienced in the podcast realm, with us on our show. And it's an honor to be on his show here. But our show is really seeking to find the space between the dichotomy, the opposition of the church is true, the church isn't true, which people can get caught up in, especially ex-Mormons who leave the faith and could get, I think, stuck in a place of hate or anger or fear or whatever these negative energy waves that they find themselves in. And we're trying to kind of synthesize science, spirituality, esoteric ideas, look carefully at church history and see it from another angle, where it's not so much about Joseph Smith being a true prophet of God or being a con man, but somewhere kind of in between there. We believe in, we talk a lot about consciousness. We talk about different states of consciousness and the things that can emerge out of those different states of consciousness. And we think Joseph Smith and the Mormon phenomenon was something that emerged out of altered states of consciousness. And I think most people who are in the church and who have experience with it can probably recognize that the spirituality that they find in it is often when they're in a different state of mind or different state of consciousness than the one they walk around with every day. So we want to explore these states. We want to explore these ideas. And we've been doing this just for a little while, nowhere near as long as Glenn. But yeah, that's our introduction. I'll pass it over to you, Glenn. Thank you.
Yeah. And apologies if I tend to jump into interviewer mode, because I have questions I want to ask you guys. It's hard for me to be interviewed. I kind of jump into interview mode. But what is Muons? So is Mormons, Mystics, I know what those are. The Muons.
Mormons, Mystics, and Muons.
What's that third part of your podcast?
It's a subatomic particle. So just kind of trying to represent Mormonism and then mysticism, which I actually didn't know what it was, but I mean, it's a pretty well-researched phenomenon of these states of consciousness, and then tying in quantum physics. And, this triggers a lot of people, but not in a hand wavy way. I mean, my background's not in physics, but it's in bioinformatics, biology, computer science. And so I have a pretty decent handle on scientific, and I'm a recovering scientific materialist. So
a recovering?
Yeah. I mean, I'm still very scientific and logical, but I've just shifted my view on materialism through Donald Hoffman and Bernardo Castro, those type of perspectives.
Okay. So the Muon is just kind of a nod to the quantum side of
the integration of modern science and where quantum ideas are going.
Plus, it's alliterative, so
it is. It's 3 M's. It's bonus. Fantastic. Yeah. So Infants on Thrones. I mean, I've been podcasting since it was either 2009 or 2010. I don't remember when the first time was that I podcasted, but it was with Mormon Expression, and I was with that podcast for a few years, and then started Infants on Thrones with a group of friends in 2012. And it's still kind of going. You know, like my motivation to put out episodes now, it's been kind of waning recently. I think as we were talking before we started recording, you mentioned the AI series that I started in a couple months ago, and I don't think I've recorded or published anything in maybe 2 months at this point. I was going to do a six part series, and I got the fourth part out of it. And one of the things I was saying, you might remember if you listened to it, is I was really interested in the space between what my unconscious processes are bringing up to me, and then, you know, like as soon as it tells me what's going on, it like raises in my consciousness. Then it's like that space between the unconscious and the conscious that I'm really interested in. And then I got hit with some doozies. I don't know if you guys have gone down the rabbit hole of attachment theory. I know, Eldon, you said that you're just starting your degree in clinical mental health counseling, but I just finished up an 8-week course on trauma, abuse, and crisis counseling. And that was heavy. And I started seeing, okay, there's some stuff in my past that I haven't really totally been aware of. And I started seeing the way that my unconscious mind calculates information and then like gives me this thing. It says, this is what's going on. And it's been a challenging 2 months as I've been like paying attention to my own internal messages that are coming through my filtering system. So I haven't really had a chance to sit down and talk about it on Infants on Thrones or anything. So that was one of the reasons when you guys reached out and said, let's talk. I thought, okay, it's been long enough. I haven't really talked about anything. This might give an opportunity to talk about some of that stuff.
One thing I'd recommend on attachment, because interestingly enough, attachment was what started my journey as I started, got separated, started this divorce process. And I started with a Google search actually of just like trying to figure out, it's like, it's not communication, but like trauma and like why we think the way we do. And then I went down attachment, the rabbit hole, and their attachment disturbances in adults is this fascinating book by Daniel Brown and David Elliott. And Dan Brown, he passed away last year, but he was into Dogen Buddhism, hypnotism, as well as a psychologist. So in that book, they have a lot of metacognition, and not just like metacognition, but awakening, enlightenment. They talk about ego development theory and just really, and I didn't know any of this stuff at the time, but it's very fascinating that's what opened my mind.
When you say Dogen, are you talking about the Buddhist monk? Okay. Dogen. Sorry for correcting you.
No.
Dogen. I had a psychic tell me once that I'm a reincarnated Dogen. So you're talking to Dogen right now, maybe, if you believe in that. So she was like, your name's what? Dow Glenn? And this Dogen. And from the east, like my last name's Ostlund, which means Eastland, and you're the second. I'm Dow Glenn Ostlund the second. Dogen. She's like, I don't even need to look in your Akashic records. Anyway. I have a special place.
On the front page.
It's right there. But I love Dogen. I got his. There's like an audio book that's a collection of a bunch of lectures that he has, and I forget what the title of it is, but I listened to that a few months ago and just loved it. So anyway, I geeked out over your reference of Dogen.
Yeah, it's a fascinating book.
Yeah. What did you learn about your own attachment style? Are you cool talking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I went deep into it. I got a couple assessments. I did the AAP, which is like the pictorial version by Carol Brown, who was, part of helped create the AAI, which is like the gold standard. I mean, I realized I was more on the dismissing attachment spectrum, and I'm going to trace it back to my childhood. I had a difficult time regulating my emotions. I had 4 brothers, kind of some chaos in the house, and certain times when I was out of control, ended up, I almost was taken to stay inpatient at a psychiatric hospital.
Really? As a
I
child?
don't know how. Yeah. And, and I understand just how hectic things were. And it was a difficult childhood. My mom did the best job that she could and really did a lot for what she was handling. But that was kind of this inflection point for me. And I ended up not staying, and I kind of shaped up after that. But that was dismissing. That's where the dismissing attachment really started. Was like, okay, it's not safe to have these feelings, and if I express these feelings, then I get taken away from my caregivers. And so,
how old were you when that happened?
I don't know, but I think I was under 10.
Okay.
I was just, yeah, I mean, I understand as a parent, if you have difficulty regulating yourself and then you're dealing with a kid that can't regulate themselves. I mean, you're parenting yourself while you're trying to parent a kid. That was kind of this
doing that. Yeah.
Yeah. That was this inflection point where I started this imposter syndrome, because I was like, I'm this monster at home, but I was this really smart, well-behaved kid at school. And I was like, if they knew who I was at home. And so, it really helped me contextualize a lot of my childhood, my way of responding to things. And I saw, like, with my kids, when they, fell down, hurt themselves, started crying, my response was to, like, try to make them laugh. And I thought that was a healthy response, but I realized, no, that's dismissing attachment, when you're like, forget about those feelings, get back to normal. And actually, sometimes you have to feel the things, and then get back. How about your journey? What was
Well, I'll check out that book that you mentioned. I'm curious. There were two books that really helped me see it better. One of them is The Body Keeps the Score, which I think should be required reading for every single person on the planet once a week. Like, tattoo the messages of The Body Keeps the Score to your brain, because your body is. your brain's absorbing everything, and just to really understand what's going on in the way that trauma, even what you might consider minor trauma, can shape behaviors, patterns, habits for the rest of your life. So The Body Keeps the Score is a big one. And then Wired for Love was another one that it came up on a search. What's that?
Who is that by? Who's the author?
Wired for Love is his name is Stan Tatkin, I believe.
Okay. I've listened to podcasts with him.
Oh, okay. And he's talking more about relationships and how your different attachment styles can either conflict or, like support, like when somebody, he calls them like a wave, or an island or an anchor. So like secure attachment is an anchor, or the avoidant attachment style he calls an island, and the anxious avoidant he calls a wave. Anyway, I like the way that he talks about them, and he doesn't focus on this as being a wholly negative thing. He talks about the positive characteristics, because this stuff happens before we're even walking and talking. As very small infants on the thrones of life, we're absorbing everything in our environment. We don't totally understand it, but we know if we feel safe or if we don't feel safe. We know if we're being taken care of, if we're not being taken care of.
And it's an adaptive strategy.
Yeah, we start developing these coping mechanisms. So like I recognized for me, and I had a lot of talks with my mom about, what was my situation like? I'm the oldest. I mean, I could give you a whole history on my family and different little veins of abuse that were through abuse and neglect and, just things like that. But me being the oldest, my dad is 7 years older than my mom. She was like 20. My dad had heard, I think it was like a Dr. Spock or some kind of thing like this, in the early 70s. He had heard that what you really need to do to have secure kids is wean them off of their mother's nurture as quickly as possible. So when I would be crying out as a, newborn, and my mom would want to get up and go and take care of me, my dad would say, no, don't. That's, you want to, sometimes having to like physically hold her down. And, like she always resented that. They ended up getting divorced years later. And then they had another child when I was 2. I had a little brother that didn't make it. He was born, he had a problem with his heart. He lived for 2 weeks. And that was a really traumatic experience for both of my parents. And just the aftermath of that, like the way that I absorbed all that and tried to make sense of my dad being really, really distant and aloof, and my mom being like really strong here, help me. Okay. I don't need this. It just, I don't totally know. I mean, I'm talking as if I really know this stuff. I've been processing a lot of this over the last few weeks. So just trying to understand why it is that I don't trust people. Like I have a really hard time trusting people. And I noticed this. I was at work and people were saying, okay, here's something that's going on. And they were addressing everybody in the group. And I started interpreting what they were saying was, they're really talking to me. Like they're presenting it to the group because they don't want to hurt my feelings, but they're really talking to me because they think that I did something wrong. And what the heck? I didn't do anything wrong. Why are they even accusing me? I didn't do that wrong. So I like caught myself doing this, and I went, oh, this is the kind of stuff that I've been doing my whole life, where I interpret things going on around me as if this person doesn't like me, or this person, anyway, I've gone down this huge rabbit hole as I've been paying attention to the way that my internal messaging system is telling me what's going on around me, and recognizing, okay, this was largely shaped by these early years when I was just trying to figure out my place in the world, my place in my family. When I was 5 years old, my dad thought that I wasn't obedient enough, and he took me out into the middle of the desert in Arizona with a blindfold on and said, you're going to have to listen to the sound of my voice. I'm going to guide you through this cactus patch, and you're going to come through safely. And this is going to be an object lesson in faith. And he couldn't see everything. And I stepped on a cactus, and it it was just this miserable, horrible experience. But that, it was like, I grew up in an environment, and probably you guys and anybody listening to this podcast had some version of this, where you're being told, don't be what you're instinctively feeling like you should be this way, because this way's right and the way that you are is wrong. And so I start internalizing that message really, really deeply. Now I could go off. I could say so much about this. I was reading journal entries this morning from my mission, and I could see in every single entry is like, I need to be better. I'm not good enough yet. Like I want to be here for the Lord, but I fail because of the weakness of my flesh, because I was like masturbating, a couple times a week, and I couldn't kick the habit of.
Were you reading my mission?
No. So anyway, that's a long roundabout way of telling you what my experience has been recently in discovering my own attachment styles, of like this chaotic, disorganized attachment style where I make up stories about people in my head that make me not trust them, and then think, okay, this is for my own benefit. And then I end up just being kind of isolated.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is so, yeah, I mean, this is what really started opening my mind, because as I was processing my marriage, I started listening to this podcast on attachment, which is where I found this book. And one of the episodes that just kind of blew everything open, it was talking about how it's very science-based, but how anxious, preoccupied versus dismissing attachment, how they perceive reality differently. Yeah, the same quote unquote objective stimuli, it just gets filtered differently. We're wearing different sunglasses, and everything just started to make sense. And yeah, I think this is really, as I, dived into that podcast, I started to see, these patterns in my life. I mean, shame was a huge one of it. One. And once you see these patterns, you kind of recontextualize. Now I can see all the memories, and I don't have a lot of memories from childhood, which is one of the indicators of a traumatic childhood, is you only remember certain parts. But all the memories I have now, I can see categorized as like, oh, that fits this pattern. I remember this because it fits this pattern. This is shame. This is like imposter syndrome. This is this insecurity about financial or whatnot. And so I think that's why psychoanalytic, psychodynamic stuff is so more important than just surface level therapy where you're doing like CBT and you're just trying to manage your anxiety and depression. It's like you can actually get to the root cause and understand your whole life.
It sounds like a challenging road to go down, though, with a lot of potential for just making life more difficult, to have an additional meta level of analysis over your own kind of behaviors in real time, probably.
I think there's an element of that. Yeah.
Yeah. I have not dug into the attachment theory stuff so much at this point yet. I know I will through my course of study, but just my own curiosities as well. It's kind of been on the list of the list of rabbit holes to go down. But I resonate with a lot of what both of you've kind of talked about. My memory of childhood is pretty spotty through most of the earliest years. And shame and guilt definitely played a huge role growing up in the church and being a missionary and just being a youth in general in the church. Just everything inside wanting to do something, but being told from the outside about how to channel, or not even channel, but just shut off a lot of it. So I'm excited to go down that rabbit hole at one point.
Yeah, and you're right. It has been a challenging couple months for me. Just as I've started becoming more aware, like this meta awareness, I think is what you're talking about. Like I'm aware of these layers within me, but it's actually been really liberating, because I don't feel like I have to understand exactly what happened or why it happened. And I just need to recognize, oh wait, the reason that I'm thinking or I'm feeling what's happening right now has a lot to do with past things that I don't totally remember. There was some trauma involved. These were coping strategies that at the time it was helping me. And it became a habit, because that's what our brains do. We create these neural pathways and our brains conserve energy. And so you get this really robust habit, and it just goes on automatic. And so I have these automatic thoughts pop up that tell me this person is really upset with you right now. And now I go, oh, wait a minute. I have the tendency of distorting reality in such a way that makes me feel worthless, and I'm doing that to myself. And so what other ways could I see of what's going on right now, instead of just being blinded by my own automatic filtering system? So that part has been really, really liberating. But you're right, it is quite exhausting as well. because your neural pathways, like, they want to conserve the energy. They want to just stay on automatic. They don't necessarily want to create something new, because that takes more work and takes more energy. And we don't even really know if this is going to end out good for you or not, from the brain's perspective. We know that this way of thinking and doing things, these habits in the past, they've kept you alive. So,
got you this far. Yeah.
They've got you this far. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that's the neurological way of just wanting to keep you in homeostasis. So yeah, it's been challenging, but I think it's definitely some of the best, most fruitful work I've ever done.
I think for me, it was such a relief because, I mean, you're organizing, when I think of the creation story, where you're like organizing chaos into order. And I mean, you're looking back at your life, which, in some degrees, for me at that point where I was like, why am I here? Why are we separated, getting this divorce? And then I started to find answers to like make sense of things and this is the journey that you go through as a newborn. You're born into chaos, and then you make constructs and you draw boxes around things to make sense of things, and you develop internal working models. And then at some point you have to update those working models because what was adaptive at one point has now become maladaptive because you're in a safer situation. And so for me, like, it was this huge relief of realizing like, oh, this is shame, like, that I've been feeling my whole life, that made me feel like I wasn't good enough, or that I had to develop my self-worth through perfectionism or graduating at the top of the class, or these other coping mechanisms. But I think it's really helpful. I've done some inner child stuff, which has been really emotional. I think to go back and to connect with your inner child that did all those things because that's actually what they needed to do and was the best thing for them to do, because instinctually, intuitively, like, you need to stay close to your caregivers, and then you can kind of let that inner child know that, like, okay, like, I'm in a better place now. You don't have to be separate from me anymore, and you can merge with that inner child. Like, you don't have to be on guard or hyper vigilant anymore because, like, you're safe now, because that part of you doesn't know that because it's still working on the same assumptions.
Yeah.
Well, Jung talked about that too, integrating the child component of us with the adult.
Yeah, and I think when have you heard of coherence therapy at all? Or yeah,
that's not ringing a bell, but describe it.
It was one of, again, a large part of my journey was psychology. It started with psychology and neuroscience, and this Therapist Uncensored podcast was really good. They really attachment based, but one of the guys, I think Bruce Ecker might have been his name. He's kind of got a model for like why therapy works, like all therapy works. It's just a framework, but I think it's called coherence therapy. But his idea is basically, the process of therapy is that you have this internal script, or I forget his terminology, basically this internal script that you're telling yourself. And to resolve it, you basically have to activate your nervous system. This probably goes along with your body keeps a score, which I've heard of, but I haven't read. But his model for why therapy works, whether it's EMDR or talk therapy or whatnot, is that your body needs to get activated. Your nervous system needs to be activated in kind of that threat. And then you need to replace it with a more correct or healthy script. And so I think the analogy they use is you basically take the filing cabinet, you have to open up the file where this is stored, and you like activate your body. And, there's studies that show that therapy works best when there's a moderate level of distress. If it's too calm and relaxed and you're not activated at all, it doesn't work. And if you're outside of this window of tolerance, it also doesn't work. There's this middle ground, but kind of open up this file by getting activated, and then you replace something else in it, and then you can kind of put that file back. And there's some fascinating studies that kind of go along with it. So, I mean, I guess how that applies to like EMDR is in EMDR, you're thinking of the negative scenario and you get your body activated and then you're replacing it with kind of an alternate resolution. And you do that a few times. But they had some, they brought on one episode was really fascinating. It wasn't specifically about coherence therapy. And I might butcher it, but it was talking about how memories are stored on a protein basis. And they, one of these grad students, I think, wanted to prove to, that this was the case. And what they did is they took these mice or rats and they shocked them and they created a response that when they heard this buzzer, they would get the shock. And so eventually they were traumatized to the point where when they heard the buzzer, they froze. And then they, the next day, once they had this response installed, essentially they gave them some drug that inhibited protein synthesis. And so then they took those rats, that group that they gave the drug, they did the buzzer and there was no shock. And then they put that group away and the other control group, they didn't give that drug to. And then when they brought them back the next day, those mice or rats that had that protein synthesis inhibiting drug, their trauma response was gone. So essentially the trauma was brought up, the memory was retrieved through the trigger, and then it kind of came out of long-term storage, but it couldn't get encoded back into proteins. And so it kind of opened up the file, took out the traumatic response, and then, now those rats, they could hear the buzzer, they wouldn't get traumatized. So, probably butchering it, but they're understanding how your body responds to trauma and how healing it is really titrating this activation and getting a different response. Your body slowly learns that, like, hey, I'm not in the situation that I was that installed this traumatic response as a child or in this relationship. And having that perspective, I think is really helpful to me. When things come up, I realize like, oh, I can grow from this because I can whittle down these responses.
I'd be interested if you do find the source of that study.
I can look it up.
I'd be interested to find it because I can understand how a drug could be given to mice that would then block the neurotransmitters so that it's not receiving the signal, so they use this Pavlovian conditioning technique, with the bell or the buzzer or whatever to create this conditioned response of fear. And what that's done is it's created these neural pathways in the minds of the mice. This is the way I understand it, right? Mm-hmm. That it's created these neural pathways. And then you've got like one population that you're giving a drug to that it's blocking the neurotransmitters that are communicating along those neural pathways that say, when you hear this sound, you feel this fear. And that drugs can do that, but they don't rewire the brain. They don't change those patterns or habits. So what I'd be curious to see in that study is if the mice were actually cured as a result of the drug, or if they just, while they had that drug in them, their neurotransmitters were being
blocked. No, this was after.
It reprogrammed them completely, so they didn't have that.
This was after. So they had the drug, and while the drug was inhibiting protein synthesis, they had the trigger, and essentially then the drug wore off their system, and then they brought the rats back after the drug was out of their system, and those no longer had that traumatic response. So
even when they didn't have the drug in their system, they still weren't.
Yeah, and the person made it clear, like, healing trauma isn't as simple as just like giving somebody this drug, but it was kind of sussing out this idea that traumatic responses are stored in your body, and that the resolution of those responses involve kind of an activation and then overwriting of that information. But it has to be in a sort of labile state. And so the activation of the traumatic response or the nervous system activation is key to overwriting it. You have to kind of take it from long-term storage to I guess short-term storage where you can change it. So yeah, I'll find it and I'll put it in the show notes. I'll send it to you. But just these type of things were really helpful to me in creating a framework so that when I have things trigger me again, I'm able to view it as like a growth opportunity. And you see that trend over time. If you don't realize that there is some way to change, it is very discouraging because you're just like, I can't change.
I think that's the most important part. And to you know, like, I think my parents' generation were brought up believing that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And, you know, what neuroscience has shown us more in the last 20 years or so is, no, we're actually quite malleable. It's not always easy to change your habits and change your ways of thinking and doing things, but you can. And, you know, psychedelics can help in creating that malleable state, but there's other things that do that as well. It's not just the drug component.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Well, go ahead, Ellen.
I was going to say, I mean, the nature of neurons in the brain, there's something like, if I remember right, something like 100 billion neurons in, you know, human brain that weighs like 3-4 pounds, something like that. Each one has 1,000 to 10,000 connections. There's been computations about the number of possible connections across neurons in a single brain is a number that's greater than all the elementary particles in the whole universe. So when you say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, I think that's very narrow minded. I talk about this often, the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset. There's a good book about that. And if we haven't put it in the show notes yet, I think we probably should. But just the notion of coming from a place where life is happening and we're responding, but we have the power to change our responses. And it's not to say that it's ever easy. And then also from a learning perspective, I'm too old to learn this, or I'm too this to learn that, or too that. That fixed mindset is limiting, and it's limited me in my life in a lot of different places, in a lot of different times. The growth mindset, I think, is the more takes more effort. Just kind of like we said earlier, it's the harder thing to do. But just the sheer number of possible connections of those neurons, I think, is a good indicator that there's always possibility to change.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I remember like 5 years ago, I remember wondering, like, is it possible for people to change? And it's because, you know, I'd been kind of going through the same difficulties in my marriage, or in Mormonism, you know, you're trying to kick masturbation, or, you know, these things, you're looking about things from the wrong perspective, or you don't understand things. And I remember really, because, you know, I was struggling with the same things that I had been forever, like, about myself, wanting to change and not feeling like I was making any headway on it. And I remember reading some article about somebody who had taken, you know, like 6 months or a year or something to try to change who they were. And they took these, you know, psychological tests and did all these things, and then, you know, took them again, you know, at the end of it, and they like moved a little bit. And it was this very skeptical view of, you know, whether you can change. But then on the other hand, now, you know, having changed so drastically in the last year and a half, you realize, like, I mean, it's not even possible, not just possible. It's like inevitable, especially if you've gone through like a rapid spiritual shift. And for a lot of people, that leaving the church, having a faith crisis triggers that. But yeah, in some ways it's inevitable. And then you look at these studies of like, one psilocybin dose, having effects that are lasting a year, 2 years plus, it's definitely possible to change, but you have to know, I think the right way to do it. And
I think you're changing all the time, whether you know it or not. I think it's impossible to not change.
But in terms of like making progress, I think, you're always changing, but
I'm going to challenge you on that, Gabe. Because like what you're calling progress is pretty subjective, right? Like what's progress to you, maybe to your ex-wife would be like, oh no, he's changed too much. Like, I don't know if you got this through your divorce, which I got through mine, but like, you're not the priesthood holder that I married. You've changed too much. I'm like, yeah, I'm in graduate school. I'm studying, I'm learning, I'm adapting my view of things. I'm questioning things. Yeah, I'm changing.
Thank goodness I'm changing.
Right.
Yeah. Some of it I think is about reframing. Yeah. What change and progress is. And sometimes that looks like it's going in the negative direction, but you end up going out on the other side.
It's progress. It's change. Somebody might say, that's not the right kind. I don't know. I'm playing with you, Gabe.
But I think in terms of like having more happiness and contentment and, like less anxiety or depression or whatever it is, I think a lot of people are like, this is my baseline. This is what I've dealt with all of my adult life. I can't, the best I can do is to take this medication. And I think there's a place for those treatments, but there's also real substantive change that you can make through. I mean, I didn't know about therapy. I remember seeing a therapist, and I was thinking about this the other day, seeing a therapist and showing up to the sessions. And I was like, I didn't really know what I was supposed to work on. Like, I knew we had difficulty in our marriage, and like at one point I had promised that I would go. And so now I'm doing it. And the therapist, unfortunately, also looking back, I realized how much they could have like prodded me and opened me up to things that I wasn't even aware of. But not all therapists are created equal too. So now therapy is such a huge mediator for change if you're with the right therapist, have the right relationship.
Yeah. And those medicines can be really help the SSRIs, especially when anxiety gets to a place where you're just totally paralyzed and you can't do anything. It can be really valuable for just mental health. I only ever hum and haw at medication when it's like I'm on medication and that's all I need, because it's like, well, actually medication's great as like putting the Band-Aid on the problem. But as far as rewiring the brain, changing those habits, like what is it that's the habit that is creating the condition? And that's the area to focus on with a therapist, especially if it's really deep trauma. Talk therapy might not be the right way to go. There's somatic therapies that, you mentioned EMDR earlier. There are EMDR techniques where they're not even really talking about, like the patient or the client is imagining what they're imagining, and the therapist is saying, okay, notice this. How do you feel with this? And they never really even open their mouth to talk about it, but it's this real powerful experience that can happen inside. And there are a lot of modalities like that to just kind of rewire the brain so that you kind of take whatever it is that is reminding you of the past trauma unconsciously. It's reminding, like there's something that comes into your awareness. Like, this guy reminds me of this person that did this thing to me, and you're not even consciously aware of it, but your body knows. And like there's ways to get in there and to address that in an unconscious way that I don't think people knew about in the past as much. And I think it's becoming more well known and supported by science these days. But anyway, I'm sorry, Alden, you were going.
No, this is all interesting. And there's something like 100 to 200, or maybe more different theories, counseling theories that it's almost like different languages, I think, where you got to come into contact with someone who's got, if they're built on certain worldviews that you can vibe with, or that resonate with you, different approaches to it. So it's probably something that takes time or a little bit of luck to find the person that speaks the language.
Right. And a good match for you. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And there's some interesting studies on that too, that like, despite all these different modalities, there's a pretty good correlation for what actually is therapeutic at being the connection between the therapist and the patient,
right?
As well as, like I said, situations in which there was a moderate level of arousal and distress, because too little or too much was just not effective, or took you outside of the range of the window of tolerance. Have you guys seen? I think I sent this to you, Eldon. There's an interesting study recently. It was talking about the windows of neuroplasticity that different psychedelics opened up. And so it was talking about how, I may not remember the specific timeframes, but there's the active duration of the psychedelic. Like ketamine will be a couple hours, and I don't know, psilocybin or LSD, I think 6 to 8, or I'm not sure. But there's the active time that it's active in your system. But this study was showing that ketamine these psychedelics opened up a window of neuroplasticity that was basically taking you back to these earlier stages of development, which, there's good evidence that where the trauma is installed or picked up at whatever kind of developmental stage that came into you is also the level at which it's best treated. So that's what you're talking about. Talk therapy might only address certain things, but there are other things, potentially sensory, autism sort of things that may be at a much earlier level that, aren't going to be amenable to that. But yeah, and then I think psilocybin was the window was about 4 weeks that this neuroplasticity was opened up, and then LSD, I think it was 4+ they stopped testing it. Yeah. It was really fascinating to see how long this range, that even though the experience was this long, you now have this capacity. And it also depends on what you do with it, because it kind of puts things into this more labile state. But that's when you actually have these disconfirming experiences where you kind of face these traumas, you have a better result. You think, oh, I shouldn't trust this person. And then you engage in them and you kind of lean into your vulnerability. And then you realize, hey, this was actually, this person did care about me. And then your whole body, basically, your nervous system can rewire and say, those warning signs that I usually thought led to this outcome, they actually had this new outcome. And so it just slowly rewrites the system. So
I'll tell you something that's really interesting that I've recently kind of stumbled upon that's right along this vein of what we're talking about, which is mirror neurons. Mirror neurons. And there's a lot of, neuroscience is a fascinating field that I'm not going to claim to know much about at all. But I've been studying these mirror neurons, this idea of interconnectedness between neurons, my neurons and your neurons. And this is right in line with probably every episode we've had of the podcast so far, Gabe, that there is an interconnectedness, collective, unconscious, and on many different layers, different dimensions where we are all connected, right? And what these mirror neurons are, how they work, as I understand it, is when there's an intention when intention is known, my neurons could fire based on your actions. And so if I'm doing something random, my neurons, my mobile neurons or whatever I'll call them, they're firing, I'm moving my hands. and it's random. So you're just kind of watching, you're doing what you're doing. If I do something that's very intentional, that you know what it is I'm doing because you've done it yourself, something like, if I were to pick my nose, then, which I don't really do in public very often, but in private, I pick it quite a bit. But if I were to pick my nose and you're watching me do that, then in those moments, if we could hook your brain up to some kind of machine that could read the neural activity, that you would have some number of your neurons related to your nose would be firing, feeling, or not necessarily feeling, but firing.
It would look as though I was doing it.
Yes. Yeah. There's a couple of researchers, I want to say their names. They're really hard to pronounce. Villianarmer Ramachandran. These people that obviously, very foreign name, but they figured that about 100,000 years ago, these mirror neurons emerged, and that one idea is that this is really what started civilization. Because if our brains from 400,000 years ago are about the same size, let's say, as they are now, 100,000 years ago or so, the mirror neurons emerged, which allowed for emulation. It allowed for being able to see each other do something and copy it. And it was because something in you was being written while you're watching me do it across neurons, kind of as I understand it. And it's really interesting. They've done these studies where they can anesthetize your hand, like make my hand numb, and then I watch your hand being touched, and the neurons for my hand are firing, even though it's numb. And I can feel the sensation of my hand being touched, even though, I can't. There's also amputees who have phantom pain, someone who's lost an arm in combat or something. They have pain in an arm that's no longer there. And they can watch someone massage their arm or their hand. And if they're experiencing phantom pain, they can feel relief from watching someone else getting that massage in the limb that they no longer have. And of course, there's a lot of inference there about the oneness, the interconnectedness of all of us. It's just really fascinating because where it intersects with therapy, as we've been talking about, potentially layers of empathy that could be tapped into, where we're feeling for each other as we're, if a therapist and a client are in conversation, and the implications for introducing psychedelics into that is particularly interesting, where you could have maybe even greater range of those mirror neurons activating, and kind of this interconnected empathy that you're sharing, that you could kind of heal through those methodologies. Something that's, I think, probably got a lot more room to grow, and I'm probably butchering it, but that's my kind of base understanding of it.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go a little weird here. Because I think mirror neurons are interesting. And I think that it's something that I bring up as when people talk about themselves as a separate self and an ego, and like, no, I am in control of my actions and I'm separate than the world around me. I think mirror neurons are one evidence that it's not a conscious thing that you're doing, and essentially your nervous system and other nervous systems, like there's so much overlap that you really viewing yourself as a separate self is a bit of a
they found mirror neurons in birds also. Apes.
Are mirror neurons different types of neurons than other neurons, or are we just talking about mirroring as a function that they've identified that neurons do, that they previously were unaware that neurons would mirror?
Yeah, I understand it as the latter.
Yeah.
That they're not informed.
It's not like a special kind of neuron that mirrors, but that all neurons kind of have this function. The way that I've understood it, that there was a study that they had these monkeys that were, they had the fMRI on the monkey, and they were watching the other monkeys do something with their hands or whatever, and they noticed that the monkey that wasn't doing it was still having the same brain activity as the monkeys that were doing it. And then they're like, well, why is that? Oh, because the neurons are observing it and they're reacting and responding by firing. I don't know what they were firing. I don't know what the neurotransmitter was. And, but just the fact that by observing these others do it, it had a neurological impact in their mind just through the act of observation, which doesn't really surprise me very much because the neurons are connected to the eye, the eye that's bringing in the photons, and it's being filtered through the brain, which is this collection of neurons and these pathways that they're constantly in contact with one another, so that these neurons would observe what's going on and react and respond in certain ways. And we're so new to understanding our own neuroscience that we look at that and go, oh, wow, look at this new thing that we've discovered.
My understanding of it is that the areas of the brain that light up in the person observing the other person doing something like patting their head,
right,
are the areas as if the observer was patting their heads,
right,
was getting their head patted. It's like the Taco Bell commercial where the person's eating the taco, your mouth waters.
Yeah.
Maybe not Taco Bell particularly, but let's say actual food, somebody eating actual food. Yeah. Anyway.
So yeah, where I wanted to go weird with this is I was listening to Rupert Spira last night. Have either of you ever listened to him?
Love Rupert Spira.
Rupert Spira, you know Donald Hoffman, Glenn. So Rupert Spira and Donald Hoffman have had some podcasts, and I like Donald Hoffman because he's very scientific and logical, but he's also very well versed with the spiritual side and has, meditates a couple hours a day. Like he integrates the two very well, but his argument stands without any reference to like spirituality. But there's a pretty good podcast with Rupert Spira and Donald Hoffman talking about the more spiritual aspect of things. But yeah, so he's pretty in line with this non-duality. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm at least, I think I say both Eldon and I are pretty in on Donald Hoffman's perspective, that space and time, that everything we perceive is essentially a representation, a simulation of a deeper fundamental reality that exists deeper than space-time. And so Rupert Spira and this
versus the binary.
Right. So everything that we see happening in the physical world, or that we experience happening in the physical world, looks like it's causative. And that's, I think, the trap that we get into with neuroscience. I think it's a framework. Materialism is a useful framework to see the correlation between different drugs and your body. And like, you can work within that framework, and there's stuff like mirror neurons. This is all helpful. But I think also recognizing that they're all manifestations in the VR headset of something deeper, but that's just how it manifests to us. You see that. I think there's a lot of these things like the placebo effect and mirror neurons that, as we as society look deeper and understand more and elevate our consciousness, the world, the simulation has to become more complex and has to account for these things to have sort of some plausible deniability. And so we see these things in the physical world and we think, oh, that's causing, these changes to my brain are causing these changes.
I'm not totally following you here, Gabe. Could you give me an example to illustrate what you're saying?
So you've listened to Bernardo Kastrup?
Uh-huh.
Okay. So I think his model of reality is really helpful because he talks about, he's an idealist, that the reality is consciousness, and what we are experiencing, that there's essentially one mind, and we are different parts of that mind interacting with other dissociated parts of that mind. And he talks about people with dissociative identity disorder as a good example of that. This is an example of somebody, one mind, one brain, that within that brain, due to trauma, they've kind of walled off different personalities, different consciousnesses, different egos that take control, have the reins at different times. And he talked about, a study that a quarter of those people, when they dreamed, they experienced the dream, all the different alter egos experienced the dream as different characters in the same dream. And so this kind of blends with Donald Hoffman's idea, because it sounds really bizarre that the universe is consciousness and that we're all parts of that consciousness and interacting with each other, because we're very sure that space and time, physical matter are real. But Rupert Spira, again, who aligns with this perspective too, is talking to the interviewer, and he's saying, think about your dream. A dream is an example where in the dream, your avatar thinks it's separate from the whole rest of the dream, but it's coming from the same mind, and the other people in the dream are coming from the same mind. And the physical matter and the space that you experience in the dream, it's not real space. I mean, it's not, it is space and it is matter, but it's all produced by mind, all produced by consciousness. Because the interviewer kept asking, he was saying like, well, when I drink alcohol, that's changing my consciousness. And Rupert's like, no, I mean, that's, you're drinking alcohol in the simulation essentially, but these are all just manifestations of consciousness. It's manifesting to you as a physical alcohol that you're drinking. And he kind of talked about this, go into the dream, and if you drank something in the dream, your avatar would experience, that they would experience being drunk. But did the alcohol in the dream actually cause the avatar, who you are experiencing, to change their consciousness? No, they're all kind of correlations to some deeper reality of the mind, that it just manifests in the dream as alcohol and the person drinking. So I don't know if that's making sense, but I'm saying I think there's use in like the materialistic view of mirror neurons and the placebo effect, and trying to have an explanation within materialism. But I think it's also interesting to think about a deeper level of consciousness or of the universe interconnectedness, and how it's kind of the things that we see manifest materially are correlating with something deeper that we can't quite comprehend.
Do you think that neurons themselves, these hundreds of billions or however many there are throughout your body, not just in your head, they're in your heart and your gut, they're all over the place. Do you think these neurons themselves are conscious?
Yes. And I think that question, people talk about consciousness and debate, whether AI is conscious or whether something's conscious. But I think the big question is like, what do you define consciousness as? Or what you define being conscious as? So my view of consciousness or being conscious is just, it's a perspective from which you can view reality. And so, I think neurons are having an experience. There's an experience of reality at that level, just like I think there is, Homo sapiens, there's a consciousness of Homo sapiens, and evolution is kind of a manifestation of that conscious, that sort of ego going in a direction that we're not individually choosing. And from my perspective of consciousness.
What do you think, Eldon? Do you think the neurons are conscious?
In a certain way of defining consciousness, I agree, and I like the way Gabe said that. It's almost like, what if the human form, the human body, is an emergent property of neurons?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one thing Rupert Spira said that I really liked. He said, your physical body is your consciousness as it can be perceived by your senses.
Yeah. That's, the more I think about the microbiome and read about that and the exciting breakthroughs with that. I mentioned this, I think, on our last episode, where they found by eliminating certain bacteria in a certain species of fish, these one researchers found that the fish no longer remembered how to school, or they could no longer school, just by eliminating a certain strain of bacteria that was in the fish's gut. And so it begs the question, how much about me is just emergent properties of the smaller things that I'm made up of? Am I just a superstructure of neuron that neurons are riding along in? And then I'm thinking,
or is your body kind of like like snails have this shell that's their home and their protection, like, and this isn't a very great analogy, but this whole collective of these billions of neurons that are your central nervous system, you are the appendages that feed them, like this community and this collective, like you are your neurons. Yeah. You're this collective, except that you, as the egoic personality that we mostly identify with, we don't really identify ourselves as a collective of neurons.
We don't. And it's fascinating to do, because when you're hungry and you're eating, you're actually just feeding billions of things that are necessary for you to be alive from one moment to the next. By taking a breath, you're alive for the next 4 minutes, roughly. Mm-hmm. And you have a 4-minute expiration date every time you exhale. You just happen to breathe in again to reset that 4-minute clock in perpetuity until everything else fails. But
Rupert Spira talks a lot about
fails.
Instead of consciousness, he talks about awareness.
That's how I think of it too. Yeah,
and that's how I view this. I mean, I view it as like a movie where it's like a movie shot from like a third-person view. And you've been watching this movie, your whole life, thinking that you're the person. And then all of a sudden, like, something happens in your life. You get a divorce. You have a faith crisis or whatever. And all of a sudden, that camera angle changes and it zooms out and you see a lot more. And then you realize, like, oh, maybe instead of the person, I'm like the camera angle. I'm the awareness. And that, so really, I'm not me. You guys aren't you. Like, we're the awareness. We're all the same awareness, but there are infinite perspectives that awareness can take. And so there's the awareness or the perspective. You can zoom that camera into a cell's perspective. You can zoom it out to a societal level. I was just reading the other day an article on Big Think that was talking about how these scientists are discovering, more and more how all of these different galaxies that are billions of light years away from each other are linked and are part of like a superstructure. And I was like, oh, crap, this is Horton Here's a Who. Like, we're the Who's and we're starting to discover Horton. And the article is really well written, because it's talking about how, you think that atoms are touching each other. You think of matter and you think it's all touching. But if you were small enough, you would see that there's space between what we consider the atoms are, the nucleus of the atoms. And so there's all this space between them. What you think is solid, there's all this space. And then it ends the article talking about how all these galaxies have all these space between them, but they're part of something that it looks like a tissue or walls or something in the universe. And it's just
when I think in fractals, that picture of the neurons and the 100 billions of them with 1 to 10,000 connections approximately each, overlay that image onto the galaxies being connected through these structures that we don't even have the instrumentation yet to fully quantify or I think it's consciousness that's bringing those scientific discoveries into light. If we get really weird here, I think the deeper we go into the Mariana Trench, the more we'll understand those structures, the principle, the Hermetic principle of correspondence. There's, and I love that article you just cited. I think the opening line was something like, solidness is just a function of zooming in. Solidness is just a function of how zoomed in you are. Mm-hmm. And so that fractal idea of where, well, when we dig into our brains and understand our neurons more, we'll dig into the Mariana Trench and understand what's inside the earth more. And we'll zoom out to the universe and understand how it's connected more. And I think we'll just find that Mandelbrot image, computer simulation of a fractal image where rhyming, repeating patterns are playing out.
Did you guys watch the Netflix docu-series Our Universe, narrated by Morgan Freeman?
I loved that.
Yeah,
I actually called that the ex-Mormon endowment video.
That's a good one. I like that. The thing I loved about that series is that it did connect different sciences together. So it's not just focusing on biology, but it's also focusing on astronomy, and it's focusing on physics, and it's focusing on quantum physics. And it's showing how all of these different, if you're going to call them conscious or aware aspects of nature, develop these habits and patterns that over time, I just loved how it showed the formation of the planet. And I didn't know that there was twin planets. I didn't know that there was Gaia, Thea. Earth, and Theo or Thea or whatever it was.
Thea. I named the bunny. We got a bunny shortly after I watched that, and we named the bunny Thea.
Nice. And that planet,
and that's sperm and egg, right? Colliding together.
But it wasn't like the sperm inseminated and impregnated the egg and something grew out of it. It just like hit the planet. It made it tilt 23 degrees on an axis, blew off two chunks that one had absorbed, the other one became the moon. And just over time, circling around, getting into its pattern, getting into this regular thing, the sun hitting the earth interacting with the sun, life beginning to emerge, single cells coming up, like this whole story of evolution. Because the planet's tilted on its axis and it spins around, you've got these 4 seasons. And so life is doing different things in different places on the planet. And I love that series, the way that it like makes me see the interconnectedness of all these things that when I was learning them in school, I learned them as separate things. And I didn't totally see how, there's this episode where it's following these turtles that, however many are born on the beach, most of them just end up being food for, birds or sharks or other predators. But the turtles that go out, they mature, they come back, they lay the eggs. And the whole point of that episode was showing how when they eat food, they're taking hydrogen atoms that were formed into the sun, and they're delivering it to the mitochondria that's in their cells so that the mitochondria can transform that into energy that then fuels the body. So it's like the sun is coming full circle within this organism, and it's all kind of like living sunlight, where like the sun and the earth combine to create these living things. Anyway, I love that series.
There's this makes me think of an article I read the other day.
It's way more interesting than Mormonism.
The Schrodinger equation is the equation for like probabilistic waveform in quantum physics.
That is both until it's observed.
No, Schrodinger equation is how you calculate the waveform, where it probabilistically is, and
probability of it collapsing into a certain.
I think this is just how you calculate the wave, the probabilistic waveform, and not on the collapse, but just the probability that it would collapse in one of those states. But this was a scientist that had discovered that the Schrodinger equation also applied on to astronomy, like on a super large scale too. So it applies on a very microscopic scale and a very macroscopic scale. It doesn't seem to apply in this middle area. And so it's the same law of correspondence.
Yeah, and that law, those hermetic principles, just serve me really well as I look at these patterns. And if we get even weirder, maybe here, as humans, one of those laws is rhythm. I think of it like a snake. A snake moves forward by moving side to side, and so much of what I see in reality does that. And if you think about like how humans, we've gone to where we're so specialized. Someone who dedicates their life to neuroscience has to spend the time digging deeper down a single line of a single discipline. And then it breaks off into another specialization, gets deeper and deeper. And in that sense, what if humans are the neurons for the AI? Because I think there's a lot of implication for AI being able to integrate all of these fields of study that a single human could never know. If I'm a 20, 30, 40 year dedicated professor in neuroscience, I haven't had the time to dig into maybe astronomy, let's say. But with the collected pool of data, the internet, and all of these findings of the specialized humans digging down into their kind of siloed disciplines, and the AI being able to circumscribe it all into one great whole, as it were, then we become the individual neurons as humans for the mind, the AI that can deliver it.
I spent a lot of time thinking about this, Eldon. I love that idea.
Have either of you listened to Matthias de Stefano at all?
You've told me about him, and he's on that perpetual growing list of people.
Yeah, he's have you ever heard of him, Glenn?
I have heard of him, yeah.
Okay, yeah. He recently in an interview, I think he was with Aubrey Marcus in Egypt, and Matthias was talking about how we are the AI of the mineral world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But speaking of AI, I know I'm curious if you've made this connection since you had that series on AI, Glenn. Have you read? You've read some stuff, I imagine, on like automatic writing. Have you read any of this stuff in relation to like the Book of Mormon as an automatic writing piece?
No, but I've had original thoughts of my own on the topic.
Okay, I'm going to find this. Okay, so there's a really good. I mean, you channel the Arcturians, right. Which is not weird at all to me, actually. Which might be weird.
Just another Sunday.
Yeah.
So
Saturday.
Yeah. So this. I mean, I guess we should. I feel like we've been fairly not weird in this episode, or woo. But yeah, I like how you've described channeling, which is just kind of, maybe I'll butcher it, but you talk about water flowing and how water flows through channels and it picks up whatever's in those channels.
Very much inspired by Donald Hoffman and Bernardo Kastrup. Okay. You know, the way that they talk about the mind as being like these filters and setting up partitions, and the way that consciousness or awareness kind of like flows through you. I like thinking of that as, you know, we're all channeling in that sense.
Yeah.
We're all channeling what we're experiencing.
And I've had, I've had phenomenon and if you look into channeled works, automatic writing, I find it fascinating. And there's some overlap between kind of a materialist view of like, oh, it's just the person's subconscious. It's things that are coming up from their childhood. And there's some
that word just.
Yeah, and that's what the
that does
materialist
some work
will say.
there, doesn't it? Yeah.
That's but there's some truth there. But with a Jungian idea, like you go to the personal subconscious, and below that you've got the universal subconscious. So yeah, it's subconscious. It's just, is it
conscious means what you're aware of. Unconscious means what you're not aware of. You can easily divide the world up into the things that I know and the things that I don't know. And the things that I don't know, you can say that's my unconscious. That's my collective unconscious. It's all the things that I don't know and the way that those processes are interacting to create what I'm experiencing right now that I'm totally ignorant of. That's my unconscious mind.
Yeah, and I think
whether it's in my head or it's the entire everything, it's like all the things that are going on.
Yeah, and like the materialist view would be like, well, my consciousness is separate. There's separateness, and so there's no way, metaphysical phenomenon, psychic, any of that stuff. That just there's no way for that to work within like strict materialism. And I mean, that's why I think Donald Hoffman, Bernardo Kastrup, that, the perspective of the dream state is also useful, because it takes the woo and it puts it into something that's very logical. I mean, it sounds crazy that the universe is a mind, the universe is mental, and we are just parts of it, because we're so sure that there's physical matter and there's space and I'm separate than you. But then we have an example every night of how one mind can subdivide, and you can look into a dream and say like, oh yeah, all these parts, these things that are happening in the dream, yeah, they're happening within that framework, but they're also representing things in my mind that, these different things that are showing up, they're actually representing things that, are stressing me out, or things that are coming up from my subconscious. And so like, I think, yeah, Donald Hoffman, Bernardo Kastrup, it allows for a very logical way of, yeah, there is a connection of, a potential connection for everything. And then it will manifest into the physical, what we experience as space and time. But there's a logical way that there's an interconnectedness. But there's a really interesting Sunstone article. Brent Metcalf actually sent this to me because I was curious on his thoughts on the book Mormon as automatic writing. And so it's talking about Mrs. Curran and Patience Worth. Have you heard about Patience Worth at all? Mm-mm. This was somebody, I forget. Okay, this was, I don't know if this is in the 1800s or the 1900s, but it's just, this article is talking about the Book of Mormon and how it fits into these other pieces of automatic writing. But essentially there's this housewife, Mrs. Curran, that was channeling this entity, Patience Worth, that was supposedly from a certain area in England.
Okay, yeah.
And so this is really fascinating. I'm just going to read. But yeah, I think she won some awards for these writing pieces. And like, if you analyze the language, it actually fits to that area of England that supposedly Patience Worth was from, and it doesn't fit Mrs. Curran. And so, okay, I'm going to read this because you'll get the connection with ChatGPT because you've played around with it. It says, perhaps the most compelling evidence in favor of Mrs. Curran's sincerity is the fact that much of the writing was produced in settings which seem to exclude the possibility of deliberate deception. For example, Walter Franklin Prince, a professional researcher of psychic phenomena who carefully and skeptically analyzed the case of Patience Worth, reported the following. A poem of 25 lines was demanded, the lines beginning with the letters of the alphabet. This is him writing. This is 1926. A poem of 25 lines was demanded, the lines beginning with the letters of the alphabet, except X, in due order. It was instantly dictated. I asked for a conversation between a lout and a maid at a county fair to be couched in archaic prose and a poem in modern English on the folly of atheism. First a passage of one and then a passage of the other, thus alternating to the end. This seemed to me an impossible mental feat, but it was done so rapidly as to tax the recorder. 4 passages of humorous prose abounding in archaic locutions, alternating with 4 parts of a poem in modern English of lofty and spiritual tenor, and when assembled, each factor made it a perfectly articulated little piece of literature. This was funny. When I was reading this, I was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I do with ChatGPT. And it's the same thing happening, but it's just in a different wrapper. And the wrapper now is AI, but it's the same phenomenon of a collective unconscious happening. And this is what I'm talking about, of like the things we see in this world. You know, AI seems to fit into materialism, and people will explain it, oh, it's not conscious, it's just these neural networks, and like there's a way that you can understand it. So I think there's like a path of plausible deniability that the universe gives people. But it just gets weirder and weirder, I think, as you go, to try to explain it without an interconnectedness.
Yeah, if you need that kind of an explanation. I mean, that was, I would be much more interested in hearing what this author channeled, like what her messages were, than like what we can do to prove whether it's legit or not. Because it all comes down, like we've been spending all this time talking about neurons. Anything that's channeled is being created by neurons. You know, it's like your
From
neurons
a
are doing
materialistic
it.
view.
No, from any perspective, like it's well, maybe you're going to nitpick the word created. Maybe it's coming from someplace and it's being conveyed through the neurons. But the neurons are what is forming my speech. It's what letting me know what words to use, what language to use. You know, all this stuff is happening inside of me, and it is unconscious because I'm not totally aware. I'm not like intentionally pulling bells and levers and saying, do it. It's my own neural networks that are creating this. So like when I do a channeling, it's a stream of consciousness where I talk about what I'm interested in and I just go with it. And I'm doing it in a voice, and I'm exploring ideas that I find interesting. And I do feel like I'm mining a little bit my unconscious, but that's kind of where it's coming from. And again, like where does my unconscious begin and where does it end? I don't know. You know, like where are these impulses coming from? I don't know.
Well, I'm saying,
and it doesn't matter to me if they're coming from an extra dimensional being from the Arcturus solar system, or that's just a fun little thing I've created to let myself have this kind of artistic expression and explore ideas without those filters of shame that we talked about earlier. Like I'm able to bypass that kind of stuff and really just go weird and have fun with the things that I'm interested in. So I don't know. I feel like for some people, it's important to do those kinds of experiments to say that this style of speaking it matches this region, and there's no way that she could have done that. So there's got to be something to it or not, huh? You know, like to me, though, that just gets away from. I want to hear what this person has to say. You know, like I don't care if it's coming from another entity or not. Like I want to hear it and have that be like a Rorschach ink blot to me, where it's put in front of me, and then I get to see how I react and respond to it, and just feast upon all of the truth that I uncover through my own true reactions and responses to whatever this thing is, and not have to surrender my idea of what true is to another person because they go, oh, no, that's impossible. It couldn't be what it is. And I'm like, okay, you're missing it. Like there's stuff that's going on inside of me as I'm listening to this. And it tells me about these filters that have been formed that we might call attachment theory or like whatever. Like my filter of processing the world. What did I just do? I just pushed a button and something happened. Are we good?
You lit up for a second.
Okay, yeah.
Like
your face transfigured.
Yeah. That's what happens when I start channeling. The Arcturians are going to take over now, guys.
Well, when you say it's being produced by your neurons, I'm saying from within space-time, that's what we that's what we experience. But I'm saying in like Donald Hoffman's perspective that this is the VR headset. Yeah, in the game, that's what's happening is, you know, this is coming through. But if you take the VR headset or you think deeper, oh, it's coming from a computer, it's coming from like this deeper simulation that we're all a part of. But it's manifesting in the game this way. So both are true. They're different perspectives. But I think there's usefulness in both of them. It's useful to look at this as like a therapeutic thing for people to do automatic writing and to see what's coming through. But I think it's also useful to have a perspective of like a universal connectedness. And then for some people, it's art. I think it's the same force. You can channel it for like a philosophical reason, or you can channel it to express creativity and create.
Glenn, you said, I think before we started recording, that you're really interested in that space between the conscious and the unconscious. And
yeah,
I really like some of the things you've said about that. Could you maybe share some of what you've discovered in exploring that? Have you, what progress or what kind of nuggets have you got back from going into that territories?
I think the biggest thing, and I don't remember if I talked about this before we started recording or if I talked about it when we were recording. But I've been paying attention to the way that I process information. So like, I was at work. Did I tell this while we were recording? Yeah. That's probably one of the clearest examples. But
it's like, it's like some part of your brain you're giving energy to, resources to be able to kind of look from the outside at what the other part's doing. And
yeah, so my understanding of the evolution of the human brain is that we have these regions that are doing different work and function in different ways. Like you've got the amygdala and the basal ganglion, these things. And so we've got this prefrontal cortex that is the most recently evolved feature of the brain. And there's other primates, there's other mammals that have a prefrontal cortex. And that there's something about the way that the neurons interact with each other in this neighborhood of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, that allows for metacognition. You can be aware that you're aware that you're aware. That's what this region of the brain does. And when there's something from your limbic system, like you get triggered, you see something that reminds you of something dangerous. Your body's doing this calculation. Your amygdala takes over and says, okay, prefrontal cortex, there's actually some real danger that we're detecting out here. We are going to reallocate the energy in the body towards fight or flight or freeze. And you, prefrontal cortex, with your rationality and your ability to like look at the future and ways the pros and cons of doing something like that, that's great, but that's taking too much energy right now. Right now, we just need to get out of whatever this situation is. And so that's not even a conscious choice. That's the brain that is reacting and responding in real time to what's going on around. And this is where I think mindfulness is really helpful to strengthen that prefrontal cortex, your ability to have metacognition. So that in those times when the amygdala triggers fight or flight, that prefrontal cortex doesn't totally shut off. You don't lose all the energy from it. It goes, oh, I see what's going on right now. I see that I am in a fight or flight state. I can feel it in my body. I can feel when my heart rate increases. I can feel my muscles tensing up. And that's a signal to me, to that metacognitive place that I've trained to become aware, to say, all right, let's take some deep breaths. Let's let that vagus nerve that runs all the way through our body know that we're actually safe right now, and get out of and I don't remember if it's the sympathetic to the parasympathetic or the parasympathetic to the sympathetic. It's one of the two. We want to calm ourselves down so that energy will return to the prefrontal cortex, and your mind isn't as narrowed on the fight or flight when you're feeling in that state. So did that answer your question, Alden?
It did. And
yeah.
That was a good explanation. I'm thinking that when I get my burger and it doesn't have mayonnaise, the part of my brain that prevents me from jumping over the counter and going and getting the manager. And I like how you talk about mindfulness as a kind of a workout routine for it, almost like training it up.
Yeah. There was a book I got a couple of years ago called Inner Size by John Assaraf. And it's, instead of exercise, it's inner size. You're doing exercises for your brain. as a way. And I loved the way that he described the brain in that book. I use images that he talked about in that book all the time when I'm talking with clients or other people that I'm working with on this kind of stuff. Because, know thyself, know your brain, understand why it is that you're reacting the way that you are, and learn to create that metacognitive space where you actually can reflect on what your brain's telling you before you act, if you can. That's a very important skill to develop. And again, going back to previous conversation, you can develop it at any stage in your life. It's, you can teach an old dog new tricks. You can learn how to create that metacognitive state to reduce your body. Like when people have experienced a lot of trauma in their lives, this is coming from When the Body Keeps the Score, which I've recently been studying. And so this is really fresh in my mind right now. Your body wants to create a balance between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. But when there's been a lot of trauma, there's a lot of things that are constantly triggering you. You've got a higher threshold. And so you've got like thinner skin. It's easier to piss you off or to upset you or trigger you or whatever it is. And so that means that there's a lot of unconscious trauma that hasn't been resolved. And so doing different therapeutic techniques, there's a lot of different ways to do this. You can put your body back into a more balanced state so that your default isn't like high anxiety kind of thing. And it takes a while. And this is where I think what you were talking about earlier, Eldon, with mirror neurons and therapy, and Gabe, you were talking about this with the effectiveness of working with a therapist. Like if you're sitting there and you're watching your therapist, your neurons are constantly observing. And if the therapist is nervous or anxious or things like, you're going to pick up on that. It takes a while to create a really safe, trusting, empathetic environment between a therapist and a client. And it's the mirror neurons, I think, that are doing a large part of that work. And once a client is comfortable and they trust, then it's easier to go into these harder places and take advantage of some of the malleability of the brain. But otherwise, if you feel like you're being judged by somebody, if you feel like, oh, the way I'm doing this is wrong, or they think that it's wrong, you're going to be kind of triggered and less malleable in that state, because your amygdala is taken over and saying, we're going to fight, flight, or freeze because there's a danger right here, whether there actually is or not. And so that metacognitive understanding can help survey the scene and tell you, okay, right now, am I in danger? Or are these echoes of past trauma that are telling me that something is afoot and I better be aware? Okay, so I'll be aware. I'll check in. I'll say, all right, I'm actually okay right now. A couple deep breaths, really do some work to try and calm yourself down. And there are a lot of techniques to do that.
This was another perspective that was mind-blowing to me, even though, some people say it's a somewhat of a simplification of like the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, but there's a lot of truth to it. And just having that idea of like that there's this teeter-totter where it's one or the other is what I remember, just less than 2 years ago learning that. And it was kind of crazy to be 36 maybe and like learning that that's a phenomenon that happens in you, it happens in your partner, it happens with other people. And, simple things just like there's, a study that I think put people on fMRIs and showed that just naming the emotion decreased the amygdala activity by 50%. I mean, or you're talking about different techniques, like having
awareness. It starts with awareness. Yeah, it definitely starts with awareness.
And that's what I think that is. I mean, the very fact that you're trying to name, anger, this is anger that I'm feeling, or this is sadness, like that, it takes your prefrontal cortex to do that. And so you're hacking the system by saying like, okay, I want to name what's happening in my amygdala. And the very fact of trying to name it requires that you get out of your amygdala a bit, or free up enough energy and move that to the prefrontal cortex. And so, these are
as if you aren't the amygdala and you aren't the prefrontal cortex, or like whatever balance, whatever ratio of all of these neural pathways. Like you said something earlier, Eldon, about like how we were emergent from these, what is it, like lower intelligences beneath us, and that I agree with you, Gabe. It's not accurate to simplify, but it can be a really helpful tool.
In the end,
like think of it as a teeter-totter.
Everything is myth, but myths are helpful. They're useful.
Absolutely.
They're frameworks. And these are the things that I remember. I think just recently I had ticked somebody off on Facebook because I was saying, like, these are the things that the church should be teaching in general conference and on Sundays. Is like,
no, it shouldn't.
Neuroscience and like there are. It's, they want to promote families and harmony and these happiness, but I think if the church can be improved or reformed or whatever the future of that is, I know some people are like, well, I'm staying, I don't believe everything, but I think that I can make it a better place or whatnot. Like, I think there are many things that could be done to help promote the things, the principles that I agree with in the church. And I wish that more of these things were taught, mental health, neuroscience, nonviolent communication. They're not controversial, but I think that it would promote many of the things that they're trying to do.
Yeah, I think they're accomplishing the things that they're trying to do.
Yeah, look at that inside peak fun, baby.
Yeah,
well, I mean, like, I think that I guess this comes down to, what's your perspective on church authorities? I mean, maybe I'm naive, but I kind
of think that everything is perfect exactly how it is. That's an emergent worldview that I've come into that might be quite radical. Because what, you think that this abuse is okay? No, I didn't say it's okay, but it's perfect. It's a perfect result of all of the forces that have gone into making this be exactly what it is.
And I think
it couldn't be anything other. It couldn't be anything other than what it is, because it is exactly what it is. It's the result of all of the choices that have gone in and all, like, everything.
And I think there's a balance. I mean, like, Buddhism is a lot about the middle way, which is, it's not like, that doesn't mean if you have -10 and 10 that the middle way is 0. It's actually -10 and 10. Like, it's both sides of the paradox. And I think that I agree that there's half your energy needs to be devoted to surrender and just being at peace with, like, this is the beautiful complexity and everything is perfect exactly the way it is. And that was a big moment last year for me in the, in the midst of, like, a really difficult trial of just, like, seeing this beauty of, like, oh, everything is, all the sorrow that I've gone to, like, it was all perfect because it brought me here, and I'm realizing these things, and it couldn't have been any other way. And at the same time, I think you can hold that while also seeking towards what I view the purpose of the universe and reality, if you view it as mind and one, like, which is recognizing that oneness and love and connection. And so I think you can both hold that everything's perfect and also strive towards increasing awareness of that interconnectedness, that oneness.
And I just want to clarify, when I use the word perfect, I'm using it in a very neutral sense. I'm not placing a value judgment on, like, that's awesome, that's great, that's perfect. What I mean is a perfect, like 1 + 1 = 2 perfectly. Like,
it's a whole.
7 + 6. Yeah, it's a whole. It is what it's the perfect result of everything that came before it, kind of.
And that's,
so in that sense is what.
And that's what
it's perfect.
I think that's one of the principles, like going into quantum physics, that I think is helpful, is realizing like this, like entanglement. You have entangled particles that are in a superposition, and then when you measure the one and you realize the spin is down, you automatically know that the other spin is up. But they equal out, like they have to balance out to this, this yin and yang. And I think these are some of the fundamental principles of the universe, I think, is this balance. And you talk about polarity and vibration and whatnot. And I think it's all, if you take the infinite and you try to comprehend it and make it finite, you have to, if you have positive, you have to have negative. And again, you have this balancing out, and it's not, the goal isn't to eliminate the differences, but it's to integrate it.
I like that. Yeah, I think it's Ram Dass. He talks about that. Yeah. And I actually thought about that a little bit not too long ago in the garden. I think there's all the lessons of life can be found in the garden. There's a squash we have that cross-pollinated at some point. And so the fruit that it's bearing right now isn't anything like what we were expecting. Mm. But all the information for what that fruit is was contained in the seed. It couldn't have come out a different way. It's all there. And there's no beginning and there's no end to that.
Do you guys know Zach Bush?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I love Zach Bush.
I just did a 17-week course with Zach Bush in one of his organizations, and just like, I love all this science-y stuff. And the interconnectedness of everything. Yeah,
well, and his view of fixing the global impending climate challenge that we have is to basically do better farming, real farming, and and I think I've been thinking about this recently, is if there was a role we could play as humans that we could see, there's no real agreed upon role as humans. There's so many competing final outcomes, let's call them, or whatever that everybody has or whatever. But if we thought of ourselves as gardeners of the planet and put ourselves back in the garden, it was this God who told us that we're dominant of the garden, that made us dominators of it. And we've seen how that has panned out. But if we get back into there and we just be gardeners of it, stewards of it, in terms of the thriving of the planet is the priority and humans are just caretakers, I think we can arrive somewhere with that.
Yeah. Are you guys wanting to wrap up, or do you want to jump down another rabbit hole real quick?
We can wrap up, Glenn. Give us another rabbit hole.
So Eldon, you mentioned earlier about humans being the neurons for the planet, and I told you I've thought about that a lot. And kind of where I am with it now is I think that neurons are the neurons for the planet. And it's not just human neurons, but it's all of the neurons. And so I think from the planet's perspective, because I think the planet's alive and I think the planet has some kind of consciousness. And, the first ayahuasca experience that I ever had, I had this really profound sense. The word that I used was conspiring, that all of the 20 people or so strangers in that room with me, that at some kind of deep unconscious soul level, whatever names you want to call it, there was a lot of interaction, communication, intelligence being exchanged, conspiring somehow. I think there is a lot of communication that happens among the intelligent forms of life on this planet, that we don't know all of them, and we certainly don't know most of them, and we don't know the information that's being exchanged and the intelligence and what's happening. But I do think that this network of neurons that the Earth has grown is coordinating and communicating and conspiring into something that we just don't really know what it is. And we're up here on the surface with our very limited umwelt of what we were able to perceive. And we go, oh, it must be this because we can see this. And it's the whole blind man and the elephant allegory kind of thing. Like, we just don't really know. And where I've come in my journey, or whatever you want to call it, I'm much more trusting of nature and the intelligence of nature and the ability of, just like the human body has this golden ratio of, we are incredibly regenerative. Like, we repair ourselves so fast. And it's just the question of, we also destroy ourselves really fast. What's the balance? What's the ratio? Are we destroying ourselves faster than we're regenerating, or regenerating more fast? You know, like, are we even aware of what we're doing? I think that's happening on the planet. I think it's happening in the solar system. I think it's happening in the galaxy. I think it's happening at all these different levels. And who's to say that the Earth isn't exactly where it is supposed to be and where it wants to be? And this is that whole dragonfly thing that you teased at the beginning. How do we know that we're not, as a planet, transforming into some kind of entity? You want to get weird and woo now, that is completely outside of our ability to understand and imagine. But it's happening, and we're all playing a role in it, and it's all really valuable. And we might think what I'm doing is really shitty to this other person, or what this person's doing is shitty to us. Yeah, I mean, that's what needs to happen. For whatever reason, we don't know, that is creating the conditions on this planet for this greater consciousness to emerge, where all of the neurons, not just the human neurons, but bring into a conscious awareness what has been unconscious with all of this communication and intelligence exchange that's going on anyway. I think that we're going to become more aware of it. I think we've already started seeing it. And artificial intelligence, quantum computing, all of these tools are going to help us. I think they're going to act as like translation devices. Like, we're going to learn how to talk to our bodies. We're going to learn how to talk to the animals. We're going to learn how to talk to the planet, and we're going to learn how to coordinate things for the mutual benefit of everybody. Once we get rid of this greed and this sense of lack and limitation and competition, and feeling like I need to lift myself up by exploiting other people and putting them down. Like, as soon as we can get rid of that, I think we're going to be in a much better place. And to me, that's kind of the point of all of this, is like, I've got this very narrow sphere of influence in my life, and both things that are happening outside of me, and then my own internal experience, which I've started paying more attention to, that space where the unconscious meets the conscious. And I got a lot of work to do, because I still have a lot of unconscious programs that were put there by my parents, who meant well, the Mormon church, who meant well, like my school system that always told me that if I didn't get the right answer, that they were saying, I'm thinking of a number. What is it? No, it's not that one. Okay, you get an F, And so I was raised and conditioned in certain ways that, as I raise my awareness to my own internal programming, and I say, okay, I don't want to do this competition, exploiting people, taking advantage, trying to get more than I give. I don't want to play that game anymore. I'm going to make some changes. I see that happening all around. I think that people are making this shift by themselves. And I think it's part of this underlying intelligence that I don't know, but I'm trusting. And the more that I look for it, this is one of the reasons why years ago, when Jason Mraz came out with the album Look for the Good, I'm like, oh man, I got to take that phrase and use that in the beginning of Infants on Thrones. I just love that, because the more that you train yourself to look for the good, the more you're going to create these neural pathways that allow you to see it. And the more that you're just looking at the shitty things and like, oh, the Mormon church, and it did this, and this is bad, and the more you're going to see that. And so what am I doing? How am I creating my own filter? And I don't know. These are the stories and the fictions and the myths that I create to cope with life right now. That's where I'm at.
I love that.
I think, and that's why I mean, my perspective is pretty similar to yours, and that's why I really like Donald Hoffman and Bernardo Kastrup and Idealism, because it teaches that there is only consciousness, one consciousness, and we are all that. Like, we think we're ourselves, we think we're the avatar in the dream, but we're actually the one. And that means this life is a big IFS, internal family systems, parts work, therapy session. And we know a bit about, this law of correspondence. We know a bit about, we can only understand reality. I mean, it's ineffable. We can only understand it through simile, allegory, this fractal nature. And so we know a bit about therapy and how people heal, and recognizing the parts of yourself and holding them and validating them and integrating them together. And it's funny that you said that you're only one person and have your own influence. But I think I shared with you in the email that it's interesting. Even though I've only listened to a few episodes of your podcast, and only in the last year or two, I was talking to a friend who, I went through, I talked on episode 6 of our podcast, what science research would call like a spontaneous spiritual awakening, Kundalini awakening, basically endogenous, altered states of consciousness, really beautiful, profound, mystical experiences. Very unlike anything I'd ever experienced. And it was through my own work and breath work and whatever, my individuation process. But the person that helped me kind of navigate and integrate, and I didn't know anything about any of this realm, was somebody who had listened to your podcast and who had done their own kind of exploration into consciousness and psychedelics, and then did some energy work. And they listened to your podcast years ago. So it's interesting that, had you not been, doing your creative work and doing your thing, it's profoundly impacted my life. And, it's very different.
Well, I appreciate that. I think that we influence each other. I mean, especially when we open up our mouths and we share what's inside of us, and whether that's through speech or through just the act, the way that we are. But, you go back to these mirror neurons, we're observing what's going on around us without really being aware of how much we're taking in all of the time. So if you can even be just like this silent, loving, compassionate person, that's going to make an impact on the people that you're around, because their mirror neurons are going to pick up on it, and it's going to put people in more of a calm state. That's good. That's healthy. There's less cortisol being created and surging through the body, and there's all kinds of health benefits to that. But this interconnectedness, whether we're trying to or not, I just don't think we can get away from it.
Yeah, and I think we talk about therapists, and this is co-regulation. Like, we think our nervous systems are separate things, but Dan Siegel, he's the guy behind interpersonal neurobiology, and he has this idea of the me-we. I think, it's me and we, like, we're individuals, but we're also overlapping nervous systems. And a friend recently talked about being out in nature and why that's so important, because it's the nervous system of nature co-regulating you. And again, if you go back to idealism and consciousness, we're all part of the same consciousness. This is interconnectedness. We're all separate. We're all one too. Both of those things. It's the two sides of the paradox.
One of the images that came to me when I was channeling once, because these are the ideas that I play with when I'm channeling, is that the universe pinched certain parts of matter, and it's Gabe. And then there's another pinch that's Eldon, and another pinch that's me. And it's like, it's this little pinched aperture through which you can experience things through your own biology, and you're getting, like, your perspective on things, but it's being fed back to everything. It's being shared with everyone. And you're not having that experience consciously, but unconsciously you are. I like that. I love
gravitational
thinking,
field.
Yeah, right. That just like, and it's temporary, like you're here for a while and then you're gone. But the experiences, being fed into that field and part of the intelligence, I've got some crazy theories about the maturation of solar systems. Like I think that a solar system develops a personality, kind of like IFS principles,
Mhm.
and that there's
It's
some
like a
solar
family.
systems that are one way and some solar systems that are another way. And like a star could become like a white dwarf, or it could supernova, where it's like spreading all of its beauty out into the galaxy, for more things, or it could become a black hole, which is all about like selfishness or whatever. Like I'm just bringing, I want the other people's light to come into me. And so like these forces, which you need both of them. It's not like black holes are bad and supernovas are good, but the way that they interact creates and churns, and it allows for variation. And to go back to Zach Bush talking about the way to fix our farming problem, he talks about the problems of monocrops and the healthiness of diversity. And that's not just in the soil. It's in our microbiome. It's in our experience of everyday life. Like if we're siloing ourselves and we're not exposing ourselves to other ideas and other opinions, we're not as healthy. We're healthier when we expose ourselves to more and when there's a lot of diversity in our life. And so having black holes and suns that are pushing and pulling and moving everything together in these spirals and these little planets that hit and turn on 23 degrees and create these seasons. And then there's life that adapts to it, like this awesome experiment game of the universe to see what is the creative potential with all of this
possible
energy. Let's explore all of it and have everything. And the more we create of it, the more potential there is. And so you've got this infinitely expanding universe that's always growing, because there's always new things being created from old things. And then those new things interact with each other and create something new, and they interact and create something new. And we're in that soup, and we're having this experience as humans right now, doing it at this time on our planet when things are changing and it's really, really uncomfortable. And I like thinking that the planet's going through a kind of a birthing process. You might even think of it as like the millennium or the second coming. And I was going to ask you guys earlier when you were telling me about what it's like in church these days, because I haven't been for, I don't know, a long time. Are Mormons still interested in like the second coming and like the signs of the times and the last days? Because that was huge for me growing up.
They're banking on it happening before the earth warms enough to.
So
they're still talking about it at church, and
I don't know. I mean,
is that a focus?
I think there's a little bit of a both. They're trying to play both sides to this. On the one hand, I think there is a bit of I know Bill Reel had put some stuff up recently about kind of some reframing of like the restoration is just getting started. This is kind of ongoing progress. But on the other hand, I think one of the downsides of not integrating and projecting out the good and the bad, the positive and negative polarity into good and bad, good and evil, God and Satan, and not realizing the oneness and just trying to not integrate the negative polarity, is that you need to have something to hope for and something to, and so I find there is focus on just like how evil the world is and how much shifting standards and, LGBT and so
it's still a lot of the us versus theming. And so because they'll do some us versus theming in the context of the last days, but not really focusing on, okay, the Savior is going to come. This golden age of the millennium is going to usher in an age of peace. And we're going to be right there in the morning of the first resurrection. I think that stuff isn't as prominent.
I don't think so. I think that they're trying to get people set for the long haul, but at the same time, I think with what the church teaches, you sort of have to believe and hope that something's going to happen, because it is very grim from the perspective of like the morality that the church teaches. I think it does seem like the world's going to hell in a handbasket. But I mean, I think I'm very positive about where things are going in the world.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming on.
Yeah.
It's been interesting to listen to episodes here and there of your podcast, and so many things that you talk about are things that I had just, kind of popped into my
So
mind
do you listen to the Arcturian Playground, or you just listen to like?
I've listened to some of the Arcturian Playground. Yeah, and it's funny because I mean, I know I've watched Wendy Kennedy. I know about the Arcturians, like, but different thoughts that you've had too about, like, I remember thinking like, oh my gosh, like Joseph Smith's childhood surgeries, like that may have broken his psyche. And then like I listened to an episode where you were talking about his childhood surgeries. So it's very interesting, the thoughts that I feel like I've quote unquote independently thought of, and I've also heard you channel through the Arcturians or put in your...
And I read that years ago in a book called The Sword of Laban, which is why I feel like when I'm doing the channeling, like I'm reaching in and I'm pulling out these things that I've been exposed to that I might not like totally remember, but it's in there somewhere. And in the act of like reflecting on it and pulling it out, oh yeah, I remember there was that thing that was in there. But anyway.
Well, I've had experience. Awesome. The reason why I view channeling as such a broad thing is, and I think it's helpful to view it so broadly, as, creative artists. I mean, you look at people freestyling or comedians or whatnot. I mean, you hear Jim Carrey or Robin Williams talk, they are channeling. I mean, this is something that's coming often from outside of them. Charlotte Bronte, when she wrote Jane Eyre, like these things just came to her. I mean, she's not claiming any theological statements on it. So sometimes it's a creative piece. Other times, people claim that it's, that it's philosophy and religion. For me, like I had some experiences last year where I was just very in touch with, it was very in touch with like a flow and mindfulness. And I had some experiences interacting. One was with like an Uber driver. And I just had some pretty impactful experiences. And I felt like I started talking to him, and in the 10, 15 minutes that he was taking me to the airport, he opened up about all these things in his life. And I didn't feel like the words were coming from me. I was just kind of on autopilot. And I feel like that's these, this flow state, or this, there is energy, information, whatnot, and it comes down, and again, whatever channel, sometimes it's a creative thing, sometimes it's a spiritual, philosophical, religious, but it's affected by what filter you have and your beliefs and kind of how you apply it. So yeah, I take a very broad view of it. And I have friends that read Akashic records or channel, and like, they're not narcissists that are trying to start a sex cult. I think that's when you start to expose yourself to a much broader picture. It's a lot harder to discount some of the things in Mormonism because they're not as polarizing as Joseph Smith is. Other people have these phenomena happen. And so I think it's helpful to take a broad view. So tell the Arcturians hi for me.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us, Glenn. And
yeah, you're welcome. I enjoyed it.
For spending time with us. It's been great to speak with you.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Thanks.